Hello there and welcome to Marketing Room 101, the podcast where I invite marketers to join me for a good old rant and give them the chance to banish one thing from the industry forever. I'm your host, Ben Norman, Strategy Director at Principles, the agency that builds unforgettable brands, and you're joining me for an episode I'm very, very excited about. That's because in this episode I'm joined by the godfather of challenger brands and archenemy of dullness, Mr. Adam Morgan. For anybody who doesn't know, Adam wrote Eating the Big Fish in 1999, which I believe is the definitive guide on how to think and act like a challenger. Since then, he set up his consultancy, eatbigfish, which he runs to this day. He's written more books, worked with a never-ending list of brands, and most recently worked with Peter Field and John Evans to uncover the extraordinary cost of dull, all of which we get into and much, much more. So here's my conversation in Marketing Room 101 with Adam Morgan. Adam, welcome to Marketing Room 101.
Thank you very much indeed. Delighted to be here.
My absolute pleasure. Adam, to kick us off, could you please describe what it's like here in Marketing Room 101 so that our listeners can picture the scene?
Yes, it's an enormous grey auditorium, and on one huge wall, there's every conceivable variety and width and range of screen you can imagine. Masses and masses and masses of them. And they're all showing more or less exactly the same degree of mediocre, identikit lifestyle kind of communication and bad messaging. And then there's an enormous crowd in the auditorium, but they're not looking at that wall at all. They're looking in the other direction. And in the other direction is a combination of Zoom screens and a number of small, bright, shiny objects that are entirely consuming their attention. So what they should be looking at, they're not looking at, and instead they're being entirely distracted by a whole bunch of either novelties or indeed mundanities.
I love that. I don't love it. I hate it, but it's a very accurate and very frightening. Almost sometimes these descriptions sound a little Orwellian, which is, I guess, the purpose. But yeah, that one sounds quite frightening.
It's a bit 1984 about it, I think. Yes, probably.
Yes, exactly. So, Adam, I wanted to kick off by talking to you about one of my favourite subjects, which is probably something you've been asked about far too many times, challenger brands. So I first discovered your work when I read Eating the Big Fish. And for anyone who hasn't read it, I think it's best described as the challenger brand Bible. That's at least how I use it now. I work with a lot of brands that would like to become or are challenger brands. And whenever I'm interviewing someone about a book that I love, all I want to do is spend the whole episode talking about it. But what I would actually say to people is go and read Eating the Big Fish, especially if you work or have any involvement in challenger brands. But I wanted to ask you two quick things, really. What do you think is the difference between a small brand and a challenger brand? And also, you wrote Eating the Big Fish back in 1999. What do you think is the biggest change for challenger brands since you wrote the book?
Yes, so I guess the two are sort of combined. So let me start off with the second one first, which is I think one of the biggest changes. I mean, there have been lots of changes, obviously, the barriers to entry in terms of funding, the availability of entirely different kinds of media and ways to connect with and engage with your target audience. So there's been masses and masses of changes. But I think the one that I'm most interested by, I suppose, is that in 1999, by and large, people still thought at that point that the predominant challenger narrative was small player versus big player. In each category, airlines, Virgin Atlantic versus BA, Reebok versus Nike at the time, or Pepsi versus Coke, there was one player who was the identified challenger taking on the other one, and it was kind of brand versus brand. And clearly, one of the exciting things about the past 25 years is there's a sort of flowering of lots of different challenger narratives, right? We've seen next generation challengers like Oatly saying, that was then and this is now. There was a time for certain kinds of choices and there's a time for a new kind of choice, and we are that new kind of choice. That's not about little guy versus big guy. That's about saying what's right for the times is a new kind of challenger. There are people who are kind of irreverent mavericks. There are all sorts of different kinds of narratives coming up. So it's really not about who you're challenging today, but what you're challenging. And there's a variety of different narratives that I've kind of worked through and played out that people I think are finding quite stimulating and useful around that. So that's the one I tend to talk about. And if you link that to your question about, so what really defines a challenger rather than a small brand, I tend to say it's two things. So one is a kind of a mindset, which is challengers tend to be brands who have very big ambitions and whose ambitions are considerably bigger than their resources, but they don't feel a victim to those lesser resources. They actually are prepared to really embrace the difference between their ambitions and their resources and think about something bold and imaginative that can close the implications of that gap. So it's partly a mindset. And it's partly also, I think, the clue is in the name, isn't it? Challengers challenge something. And part of that is about challenging themselves and their ways of doing things and challenging their orthodoxies and their path dependencies. And part of it is saying about, what's my place to stand in the world? What am I going to stand up and represent and challenge? Not somebody, but what am I going to do? And not every brand is prepared to do that. Not every leader is prepared to do that or take a place like that. And clearly, you don't have to be strident in the way that you do that, but you do have to have a very strong sense of identity and what you want to stand for and what you want to stand against. And actually, that does sort out the sheep from the goats.
I think that's something that resonated with me from the book. And I think it's interesting what you said there, because I think that actually suggests that it's as or more relevant today as it was then as well. Because like you say, the idea of small versus large isn't the idea of challenger versus non-challenger, is it? And now as the media landscape evolves, as everything, the media sense has at least changed, it's potentially changed that dynamic between small and large. But equally, I get clients coming to me regularly saying, we're a challenger brand. What really they mean is we're a smaller brand with a smaller budget and we want to try and in some way punch above our weight. That's why I find it really interesting to refer to what you'd written in 1999 that is still as relevant to the clients I speak to today, which is it's not really about your size, is it?
I agree. I think your disconnection of challenger mindset from small is a really important one. There was a really interesting headline in the FT in about the first year of COVID, I think, by Reed Hastings of Netflix. And the headline was a quote from him saying Netflix is still in challenger status. And what he meant by that was, even though we're number one in the US, we're very small in the world, there's masses of upside potential. And we need to keep thinking like a challenger effectively. And then if you look at what happened over the next couple of years, about 6 months later, everybody said, well, okay, Netflix, their days are numbered because now Disney Plus has launched into the whole mix. And Disney Plus put on more subscribers in 1 year than Netflix put on in 10. So everybody said, well, Netflix is toast. Look at all the other people piling in. And so you could argue that Netflix then said, okay, well, now this is actually defensive rather than offensive, effectively. We have to think like a challenger to keep evolving. They make a couple of shifts in their business model. And now what's happening? Well, their stock price is pretty good. Disney's in the tag. Paramount is in the tag. I mean, all the other people who've plunged in have kind of fallen away. And at the time, when he made that quote, I think Netflix was worth 20 billion. So it was 2/3 of the size of the Coca-Cola company already. Enormous business. But his point was it's relative and it's a mindset. It's not about an absolute or an actual size. And I think increasingly that's important. And in fact, we as a business, eatbigfish, a company, when we started, people would ring up and say, we need to challenge a brand strategy. And you go, okay, great, but we've got to do a bit of cultural work, with your team to make that work. And they go, okay, as long as you give us a challenger strategy. Now, at least as much, possibly more, we get clients ringing up saying, come and help us get a challenger mindset. So I think that's another shift, really, in a sense that people's understanding is it's not about what's the strategy for this brand. It's more about how are we going to show up as a team and as a group and behave? And what does it mean collectively for us to have the right mindset? I think is the other big shift around challenges.
I agree entirely. Before we move on, I guess the thing that always has stuck in my mind from the book is the idea of intelligent naivety. And that idea of the first place to start with that mindset is to cast away this idea that you have to follow category convention, or this idea that you have to know everything about a category to disrupt it.
Yeah.
Because part of challenging something is by being able to see it from a different angle, isn't it? It's getting that perspective that is from outside the category. It's easier said than done, I think, isn't it?
I mean, in a sense, it's difficult, but also there are some interesting practices that you can get into. So I interviewed the co-founder of Anthropology, the US-based store, at one point, and he was said that in the early days, they were very different and they would them to stay different. So they had a very simple practice that they did. In every store, they had what they called Monday morning meetings. And every Monday, all the staff would start off on the Monday discussing 3 things that they'd done or seen over the weekend that they thought could be interesting for that store. Brilliant. So they were constantly feeding in life experiences entirely outside the retail experience that they thought could be stimulating and interesting. And I think it is possible to bake those experiences into what we do. And, strategists tend to do that anyway, as a matter of course. But it just gets hard. The more we are pressurized to be productive and efficient, the less that space to do that is naturally available. So we have to make it and institutionalize it.
So last year, you teamed up with Peter Field and John Evans on what was called The Extraordinary Cost of Dull, which is available as a white paper via System 1. Can you just explain to me how that came about and what you ended up finding out?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been in the business over 40 years now, and I started the same week as Peter Field in our first agency in 1982. And I was sitting about 18 months ago up with my mum, who lives in a place called Ludlow, which is on the Welsh borders in the UK. And we were watching evening TV on a Saturday night, watching the centre break, the most expensive airtime apart from big sporting events you can possibly buy. And I sat there and all of the advertising was just awful. It was just mediocre. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't shockingly bad. It was just mediocre. And I thought, my mum thinks I've been doing this for 40 years. it's amazing she's still talking to me, really. I mean, God knows, she probably didn't want me to go into advertising in the first place. But at least, she might think, okay, well, Adam's done a few nice bits and pieces. But I look at that and I thought, I'm just embarrassed. I'm embarrassed for my profession. And the more I talked to people, I realized that actually it's not that, well, of course, we're not all smart, well-intentioned people. It's just that there is this tolerance for dull because we don't realize quite how expensive it is. And for all that, Peter Field and Les Binet and a number of very smart people have created a lot of knowledge about the upsides of creativity. It just isn't landing. So I thought, well, look, maybe can we flip this? I was very intrigued by the Daniel Kahneman observation about, the pain of losing something is twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining it. Yep. So I thought, I said to Peter, can you turn your IPA data upside down? Instead of showing us the upside of creativity, could we put an exact cost on being dull? And being the brilliant thinker and analyst that he is, he said, great, I'll have a go. And so, to cut a long story short, he took the IPA data and he split them into cases into two. So half the cases were cases that had succeeded using kind of rational or information-based methods, and half of those were those that have sought to be famous and been much more emotional. So they're both successful, but said, actually, look, the rational-based stuff, either dull stuff, in order to have the same degree of commercial success, had to spend, on average, £10 million more per campaign. So dull is a choice, but it's a very expensive choice. You can choose to be dull. There might be all sorts of reasons why you and your business and your client might want to be dull, temporarily or permanently. But if you do that, understand what the cost is. So I was very excited by that, because I thought actually we could start to have a whole new conversation about this. So we then went to John Evans on his podcast and talked a little bit about the work that we've been doing. And then he and System One worked with us to look at some data for the US as well as the UK. And we put a industry cost on, we divided all the kind of output from the last 5 years in the US into 4 quartiles of least dull to most dull, and looked at how much the 3 most dull quartiles would have to spend in extra media money to have the same impact as the least dull. And that turned out to be 189 billion, which is roughly the same as the GDP of Greece. As intriguingly, I thought, I sort of said to John, well, let's do something simple. Let's take a very dull piece of communication. Let's do a 20-second shot of a cow chewing grass behind a barbed wire fence and put it through your database and see what proportion of your ads it beats. So System One, as you know, they've tested, I think, 55,000 ads in every single ad that's ever run in the US and the UK since 2017. And a 20-second shot of a cow chewing grass beat 50% of their database. So I think part of this is about logic, part of it's about magic, right? Part of it is about capturing the imagination, part of it is just saying, let's give you some concrete numbers. Because we want to make an intervention, we want to give people the tools to make an intervention. So that was very much the first stage of it. And I'm seeing it very much as a kind of a 3-year project, really. So the first year was about the cost of dull content. This year, I'm working with Dr. Karen Nelson-Field on the cost of dull media. And then next year, I think we'll look at the cost of dull product. So it's a trilogy like Dune, but with fewer sandworms, effectively, is my general idea.
Yeah, it sounds exactly the same. Yeah, the storyline's the same. I think what I like about it is it gives me more ammunition when I'm speaking to clients, and it's been very, very useful so far, and I'm sure it'll continue to help with that case. I think in particular, when it comes to clients trying to speak to the people that are making the decisions rather than just the marketing team believing in what Les Binet and Peter Field are saying and thinking, how do I get someone else to believe in this? But I think what you've done really, really well is the idea of not making this white paper dull either, or not making the outputs of what you found dull. You said about the cow eating grass, you're doing it in a playful way. If we can make a white paper entertaining, God, you better be able to make your ad for a beer entertaining.
Well, I hope so. And so, by the time this has gone out, we're recording this the week before Cannes. Karen and I will have spoken at Cannes. And again, so I was trying to work out, besides Karen's extraordinary analysis, she's done an amazing piece of analysis that I think is fascinating about just how expensive dull media is. A, that it can be dull, and B, how expensive it is. But also, I thought, okay, we need a version of the cow. What's our version of the cow this time? And so the president of a French agency wrote to me last year and said, I'm very interested in the cost of dull. We're going to look to replicate this data analysis in France. And in France, cost of dull translates as le coût d'ennui. And I thought 2 things, really. One is, what a fabulous language French is. It can even make dull sound sexy. You know what I mean? Yeah. And second is, ennui sounded to me like one of those big over-the-top perfume ads from, the 1980s. So I thought to myself, wouldn't it be fun to launch at Cannes a fragrance called Ennui? that smelt of burning money. We literally mock it up. We'll have a little stand outside. So as people are queuing to get into the auditorium to listen to Karen and me, there'll be a stand outside. We'll have people spraying the fragrance. We'll have a description of the top notes, the heart notes, and the bottom notes, hint of resignation and a top note of acridity, and just have a bit of fun around that. So that's the thing we're doing this year. So again, just trying to get some conversation and some attention around it, because we can't afford to be dull about dullness, frankly.
So you're here today because you would like to banish something forever. Adam, what would you like to banish from the marketing industry?
I would like to banish the distracted tolerance of dull. So there is too much dull, quite clearly. There's too much mediocrity. And as I say, it's not because we're not an industry full of smart, well-intentioned people who are working their hearts out. All of those things are true. And yet we're still producing this stuff. And we're producing it because we are too tolerant of it, because we're too distracted. We've got too much else going on. We are telling ourselves lies, telling our clients lies and having little lies in conversations that are not doing us any favors at all. And we're allowing this to happen without realizing the cost that it really has to us as a business or to us as an industry, I think. And so that's what I would like us to make an intervention about.
I think you've touched on something interesting there where you talked about we are distracted. But I think, is it that we're distracted and also our sensation is dull towards dull? I saw something interesting recently where some numbers had been put out by P&G which showed that ads with no emotional impact whatsoever, the impact of that ad was almost flat. The impact was almost nothing. Ads with a positive emotional impact had an 8 times increase in ROI over no emotion. But ads with a negative emotional response still had over 2 times the impact of no emotion. So I think there's something interesting to be discussed when it comes to the concept of safe. And what does safe mean? Because we might be this distracted tolerance of dull, but it's also the idea that we think it's a safe bet. I don't know if that's what you've seen in your work that you've done, but for me, the safest bet is to try and provoke feeling. The riskiest bet is to provoke no form of emotional response.
I completely agree. And I think actually one of my frustrations about places like Cannes is that there's too much talk about bravery from auditoriums, people standing up and saying we have to be braver. And I don't think it's about bravery. The whole point about trying to cast this conversation in a more financial way is to say it's actually about risk and responsibility, to your point, which is what's the responsible thing to do and what's the risky thing to do. And that actually very often those two are the other way around. You might be thinking, for instance, in the case of dull media, that actually it's the responsible thing to do to not spend too much time going after active attention, but, just to kind of make some sensible choices about certain kinds of digital formats and that kind of stuff to get greater degrees of reach. Actually, when you look at it, Karen says that's not the responsible thing to do at all, because your attention just dies and nobody's seeing you. You're not getting past that kind of essential 2.5 seconds that everybody needs to build memory structures. So it's not that actually it's expensive, it's just that it doesn't work at all. So I think that whole sense about let's have a very different conversation about what is the risky and what is the responsible thing to do around attention, around dullness, around getting noticed, around things like emotion, I think is a really, really important conversation.
I think there's something in the idea of there's not a rule book here, but there are things that we can do and the things that we know work, and there are things that we know are the constituent parts of great advertising. But maybe the fact that we are so distracted, but it's also we're too distracted away from actually learning what the alternative is. The answers are there, aren't they? We've got the answers now for what we can do as an alternative.
No, I agree. So I was talking to a very interesting guy the other day who's now part of a consultancy, one of the big consultancies, and he had been a brand manager at Unilever. And I said, so, what made you move on? And he said, essentially, what I was doing as a brand manager was trying to get the idea to work across the 40 different channels I needed to make it work across. I wasn't really thinking about how can I make the idea as good as possible. I was thinking about the practicalities, about all the different kind of logistical things I had to work in. That's what I mean by distracted tolerance, which is I just don't have time to make it any better because I've got to work out how to get it fit into these 10 things it doesn't otherwise fit into. And it's a fundamental reprioritization of how we're spending our time, I think.
Yeah, and it's less about, will this big idea really work? Does this big idea really land? Does it provoke emotion?
Yeah.
To, does this idea work across every possible touch point? And yeah, you're right. So what do you think the timeline is of this distracted tolerance of, because it's appeared over a period of time. It's clearly here now when it clearly wasn't always here. So what do you think are the sort of factors that have led us here?
I think one of the things that John and I talked about last year was the Four Horsemen of the Dullocalypse, the 4 qualities or sort of macro trends that were, I suppose, tailwinds, let's say, behind this. So let's just play out what they are, because I think they're kind of relevant and none of them are AI. We can get onto AI later on. So one really was the idea. So Peter was in the room. He'd be talking about performance now. And the whole notion of performance marketing has just completely changed people's sense of how interesting you do or don't, or how emotionally engaging you do or don't have to be. Because actually, if people are thinking, well, actually, it's all about short-termism and it's all about nudging people across, I'm kind of assuming they're already in the category. I don't really have to kind of engage with Ben too much because he's already interested in what I'm doing. And of course, that's just not true, right? Only 5% of people, by and large, as we know, are actually interested in the category, or in the category at any one time. So Peter would say that performance mindset, a misjudged sense of performance, which I guess is since, the late noughties, effectively, that would be that timeline. Then I'm sure you've read the Age of Average by Alex Murrell, that collation of just that sense of benchmarking, what equivalent of benchmarking, effectively, how everybody thinks, oh, well, everybody else is doing that, so we'll do that too, because that must be the best way to do things. So at some level, an understandable assumption, but leading unintentionally to kind of mediocrity. So that sense of not really setting the bar high enough and not trying to be different, but benchmarking what other people are doing and taking your cue from that. The third, I think, is very much this notion of optimization, that it's a bit like the person optimizing their idea across 30, 40 different channels, or those very famous slides. I think I've seen some that Velvet Shark did that I talk about, which I think are very nice, looking at how logo changes in tech, for instance, have adapted over the past 10 years, and how actually, in order to make everything sort of fit on a thumbnail very cleanly, they've stripped out any character or any personality from the logo. So they all look exactly like each other. So again, smart, well-intentioned people making what on its own seems apparently a sensible and responsible decision, actually unintentionally leading to blandness. And the fourth, I think, is procurement and the growth of procurement, really. I was talking to somebody in a US agency who was saying that they'd been pitching for a year for a very big client, and ultimately procurement had kind of come into the two rival agencies and said, effectively, if you take it at cost, then you can have the business. And what, of course, that means is that the ability of an agency to invest in getting great ideas out is considerably diminished, because by and large, one of the key bits of expense for an agency is the number of times your creative team goes round and round and round and round getting great ads out. And what it means is if you're not making any money right from the get-go, you're only going to do that 2 or 3 times, and you're simply going to give the client what they want. And if the client is distracted, wants something that can work in 30 different formats, neither of you is going to get anywhere good. So again, procurement is an example of, it's a very sensible thing for a business to mind its costs. Of course, it should have some oversight over that, but the way it's doing it is unintentionally leading to very expensive consequences on all sides. And one of those is dullness and all the cost that comes with that. I'm not pretending those are the only 4, but I think if you look, you can see a number of things combining to create that kind of collective result.
I think it's interesting, the point you talk about, but related to performance and procurement there, I guess, which is the that obsession with measurement, but that obsession with proof, where I think 20 years ago or more, people knew that advertising worked, and there was a belief that advertising worked. Therefore, let's do some advertising and it will work. And we know the sort that works, the sort that makes people laugh or they talk about in the pub. But I think there's been that prevailing idea of efficiency over effectiveness, hasn't there? I can't remember who said it, but just because something's more measurable doesn't mean it's more effective, doesn't mean it's more valuable. But I think there's that sort of obsession, isn't there, now through those procurement teams of what are you going to deliver me in return for my money? Yeah. That affects the sort of advertising we therefore have to produce, the channels that we select. If we obsess over pounds in, pounds out, rather than believing that some things are more effective even if they're less measurable, I think is quite an important point, really. It's quite a big shift.
And I think this also relates to your bit earlier on about how do you frame this in the language of the boardroom and the language of the CFO. In fact, part of the cost of our project, we are doing some work with Karen Crum and her team at EY, looking at her learnings from clients and how to frame things more commercially for them. So part of the ambition for this is to take all of those outputs and then frame it in a very deliberately commercial way that you could take to somebody in a PE company or somebody who's a CFO. And that's a bit of work we still need to do.
Absolutely. And I think that'll be really, really useful for clients, agencies alike. You said we can come back to AI later. And I do make a point on this podcast of not banging on about AI all the time, but I am curious to sort of pick your brains on that, which is when we consider dull, and if we consider the rise of the distracted tolerance of dull, what is the role of AI in the world of dull?
Well, if I was to be hopeful and I was to say, why will AI be the savior of communications and marketing business? This is what I'd say. So I initially, until about a year ago, I thought that AI was going to be another accelerator another horseman of the Dullocalypse, right? It's just going to accelerate all those other things and make them much, much worse. It might be that that person who was the Unilever brand manager, it might be that actually AI helps them drop their idea into 30 different formats in a much easier and simpler way, so they have more time free to focus on the quality of the idea in the first place. It might help like that. We'll wait and see. But then actually somebody got in touch, someone called Gabrielle Tenaglia, who I'd worked with a long time ago when she was a planner on Audi at an agency called Venables Bell. And she was now working with a financial services startup called Lettuce, and they do tax advice. So Ben decides to start his own company making mineral water. Lettuce give you tax advice about how to structure your business as a solopreneur in a way that you get all the breaks that you should do. So it falls under the important but very dull category. And so Gabrielle said, well, I know I've been listening to your podcast, Adam, and I realized that we've been doing some quite worthy but dull kind of bottom of the funnel explainer stuff. I want to do something more interesting. And so here's what I did. I wanted to do a musical about tax services that would be our communication for Lettuce. So she said, I briefed 2 freelance creatives out of a very good agency called 72 and Sunny, and they produced 8 ideas. And I took them to my fintech CEO. So obviously not the brand building, knowledgeable, enthusiastic, quite sort of skeptical, gimlet-eyed figure. And she said, I want to make these using AI. So very low cost. I want to make sort of, 4 or 5 of them and test them on Facebook against each other. And he said, well, how much would it cost to make all 8? So she said, well, it would cost this. He said, well, let's make all 8, test them. So they made all 8 using AI. They tested them on Facebook, and the musical about Lettuce outperformed the others by a factor of 9 or 10.
Brilliant.
So suddenly having to convince your CEO, who is not a marketing expert, that actually this really bold, interesting, differentiated approach is going to generate much better returns becomes a very simple one, because AI has entirely removed the cost of proof. And so then the other thing I'm very struck by in the States, of course, is that in one of the dullest categories, i.e. financial services like insurance, Geico started off doing creative advertising. So then everybody had to do creative advertising. So I thought to myself, this is really interesting. Maybe the future of advertising is a kind of love child between Lettuce and Geico, which is if we can all take that cost of proving that a much more creative idea works much better than the dull stuff and prove to CEOs who otherwise would never have bought it. And then actually one person doing that in the category kicks off kind of arms race because everybody realizes we all have to do this because it's so much more powerful. To your point about P&G, we all realize that, oh, wow, they're doing really emotional stuff. Look at their share charts, it's off the scale. Then actually the combination of those two things might just kick off a really interesting, different dynamic in the business. So if I was feeling punchy and you'd got me after a couple of glasses of rosé and can, that's what I would be pitching you as my future of advertising and why actually AI is going to save us all.
It's interesting. So what we're doing is we're moving away from this world where creatives get frustrated that nobody listens to them when they say emotion's the way forward. We need to do an emotive. We need to do brand building that provokes feeling. The board won't listen to us. But I can go out and test because AI has lowered the cost of production, or at least production to a point that I can test so much.
Exactly.
And I suppose it could just be that it's a better version of an animatic as well, couldn't it? It could be that gone are the days where you have to do a storyboard and you get some level of testing. It's never quite right. You can create the whole ad. And whether you run that or whether you just use it to prove the concept, you're absolutely right. Nothing's going to convince the board quite as well, is it, than seeing we tested all 8 of these ads with real people.
I agree. And of course, it raises all sorts of ethical questions about production and, but yeah, I think it's really interesting and dynamic. And I'm going to be very struck to see how that develops.
I'm excited by that. I'm convinced by the argument to banish the distracted tolerance of dull. What I'll do is I will lump in with that the Four Horsemen of the Dullocalypse. So, we're banishing the distracted tolerance of dull. But while you're here and before you leave us, Adam, is there anything that you would like to bring back into the marketing world that you think is down here by mistake or is ready to come back?
Yes, I think, a lot of what I think this is to do with is attention and intention. So paying more attention to what dull is really costing us and being more intentional about avoiding it, I think is key. And so I would like to bring back into our business something that Avis introduced with DDB in 1962 called, in their case, the Avis Rent-A-Car advertising philosophy. So Avis, for me, as you know, my enthusiasm expertise is challengers, and Avis for me is the kind of godparent of all challengers because they were the first to take an apparent negative, where number 2, and turn it into an advantage. That's a brilliant example of not being a smaller brand, but being a challenger, to your point, right? They were the first to actually do that. That mindset shift, they were the first to kind of famously do. And, the contextual situation for Avis it was very interesting. They'd lost money for the previous 12 years. They'd been bought by a bank, Lazard Frères, who were not fond of organizations that lose money that they own. They had a new CEO gone in, a guy called Bob Townsend. And Bob Townsend effectively sorts out a lot of the infrastructure to do with the quality of the fleet and that kind of stuff at Avis. And then he appoints DDB as an agency. And then he does this really interesting thing. He talks to Bill Bernbeck, and they agree how they're going to do ads together in order to succeed. And they agree a 7-point, as it were, horizontal contract between them about how they're going to work together that will inform everything that they do. So I'm just going to read out kind of a couple of bits of this for us because I think they're really striking. So the first was, Avis will never know as much about advertising as DDB, and DDB will never know as much about the rental car business as Avis. So mutual respect, right? You're a professional in your area. I'm a professional in my area. We will respect each other's professionalism. And I think that's kind of interesting because I'm not sure that exists quite so much anymore, if I'm really honest. I think agents are slightly frustrated because they think they could run the business slightly better than the client, and clients certainly think they could do ads slightly better than the agency most of the time. So there's a basic respect there. The second is the purpose of the advertising is to persuade the frequent business renter, whether on a business trip, a vacation trip, or renting an extra car at home, to try Avis. So we're all clear on what the communication is trying to do. We'll always be trying to do that. It's not going to change from ad to ad. We're always going to be doing that same thing. So it just takes out a whole lot of conversation at the front end. This is the bit I really love, though. 3, a serious attempt will be made to create advertising with 5 times the effectiveness of the competition's advertising. So Hertz is spending 5 times as much as Avis. So in order to succeed, Avis has to do something 5 times as effective. Now, I should say that once they did this, he framed it and hung it on everybody's walls who worked in the agency and on the client side on this business. So imagine you go to every single meeting, and above this meeting, you've got item number 3 saying, we're all trying to create something 5 times as effective as the competition. That's a big bar, right? I think you come in with different kinds of content to that room. I think you have different kinds of conversation in that room. I think you have a different kind of energy around the conversation and the ads you're having in that room. So just that intentionality, and adhering to it and a contractual basis, I think is fascinating. Number 4, to this end, Avis will approve or disapprove, not try to improve ads which are submitted. Again, interesting, right?
Amazing. Yeah.
So we'll either buy it or we won't. The kicker is this, though. 5, to this end, DDB, the agency, will only submit for approval those ads which they as an agency recommend. They will not, in inverted commas, see what Avis thinks of that one. Which I love, because actually, you and I have both worked in advertising. You still work in advertising. We've all sat in that room, right?
And we try, don't we? We try and have the confidence to only go in with what we think will be right. Or we try and go in with a clear recommendation. We try and say to ourselves that we absolutely don't want to present something that we don't think is right. But also, we know that where the power balance is, and we know that sometimes with a client relationship, like you say, if the client does believe that they can create ads better than us, and we know that our recommendations possibly aren't going to be listened to, we still need to get the job out of the door. We need to get paid. So we'll stick something in that's going to please the client.
Yep.
And it's sad to say that out loud, isn't it?
But it's true. I mean, the other 2, one is about media selection, but I'll just note that part of it says media judgments are open to discussion. Conviction should prevail. Compromises should be avoided.
Yeah.
Again, just interesting to formally state that. And the 7th was just about the fact that all the cars were made by Ford, and Ford just had to sign off and approve it. So anyway, my point about this is we all have financial contracts with our clients. I actually think this kind of contract of intent is much more important. I would bring back in, to cut a very long story short, horizontal contracts of intent about how we are going to do great work together that I would make binding by making them very public and adhering to them and getting the CEOs to sign off on them. I think that would be a very powerful step forward.
I love everything about it. I think point 3, a serious attempt to be 5 times better than the competition. I'm with you. I think that stands out, doesn't it? Because what I can imagine that does in the real world, when that's on the wall in that meeting, it takes out the subjectivity, it takes out opinion. And what it does is it allows you to point at that wall and declare that you're being hard on the work, not the person. Mm-hmm. We can't proceed further with that idea. No offense, but that's not going to be, we're saying 5 times here. We're not saying is that marginally better than the competition. If that's not going to blow them out of the water, let's stop talking about it and focus on something else.
I agree. And I think it's the maintaining of it through the process. Because there is something lovely, isn't there, when you're pitching a client and there's that great sense of mutual ambition and that kind of expanded canvas, and the client will say, this is not just about the ads. And then you've come up with ideas that are not just about the ads. And then suddenly 6 months later, it is just about the ads and it's just about this ad. There's no room or time for that, sadly. So the relationship gets smaller with a client, I think, almost the longer you can go on with them. And this, I think, keeps it quite big and big ambitious and keeps that intent there throughout.
So I'm going to give you that back. I'm going to give you back mutual contracts of intent so you can take them and distribute them throughout all client agency relationships. Now, just before you go, I do ask a question every week that my brother sends me of my guest. He doesn't work in the industry and he comes up with a question. And his question for you is, in the 1975 movie Jaws, the shark is killed in a dramatic finale when Martin Brody thrusts a scuba tank into its mouth, which explodes when a shot from a rifle is fired. Is there a brand or campaign you can think of that blew up the big fish in similarly dramatic style?
So, first of all, it's a fantastic question, and your brother is an absolute genius, and I love that. And I can genuinely say I've never been asked that question before, actually. You might be surprised to hear.
Always try and have a first, yeah.
Indeed. So I had the enormous pleasure of working in the 90s for 4 years at an agency called Chiat Day in Los Angeles, and they did the very famous Apple 1984 ad, and clearly a long, long time before I was there. But I do think that in its own way was exactly that. I think that completely changed the way that people thought about the relationship between Apple and IBM, and made Apple famous and made Steve Jobs famous. And I think that was the equivalent. And I don't think anybody actually has really done it in quite the same way since, certainly in the UK and the US. I think that would be a really good example of that.
I think what I love about that campaign, the idea that it wasn't just an ad campaign, it was an entire transformation of a brand told through a creative campaign, but it was everything coming together, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. And going back to a lot of what you talk about when you talk about challenger brands, it's not just the lipstick on the pig, is it? It is the whole thing. I think there's something incredible about that. And I also like that that's allowed us to do a George Orwell bookend on this podcast.
Exactly.
So it was worked out perfectly. Adam, I am going to let you go. Before you go, I would like to just ask, you have an absolutely brilliant podcast. Let's make this more interesting. What's the premise of that and how can people find it? And also, how can they get hold of you if they want to reach out to you?
Thank you. So the premise of Let's Make This More Interesting is it's the kind of twin of The Cost of Dull, in a sense that it's the room that we can walk into and say, how can we get fresh inspiration about how to really engage and hold attention? And so I wanted to learn from people beyond advertising and marketing alone, whose job it was to make apparently dull subjects more interesting, whether they were reality TV show producers, whether they were teachers teaching science to 12 or 13-year-old kids, who weren't particularly interested in science, let alone Newton's theories of forces, wildlife documentary makers, whatever they happen to be. And so Let's Make This More Interesting is a series of conversations with people in fascinating fields who, for their own reasons, have had to make apparently dull subjects more interesting. So, for instance, one of my favorites was with the head writer of Sesame Street, a guy called Norman Stiles. He was the head writer of Sesame Street for roughly the first 20 years, talking about how they created little dramas. And there are two parts to little drama. One is you have to know what the character wants, and the second is you have to know what's in the way. And out of those two things, you can get anybody interested in anything. Fantastically interesting. So each of them, I think, has something to teach us about how we can engage. And at some level, I was just trying to think about how do we show up in a much more interesting and compelling way. And so we're just finishing the second season at the moment. So sometimes it's really about marketing. Sometimes it's a little bit broader so people can pick and choose what they want to get into.
What I really love about the podcast is it's a broader thing for me, which is the best creatives, the best strategists, the best creative people. I don't just mean creative execution, but the most creative people learn from beyond the industry. We don't just spend all day looking at ads. That's great. But actually, I'm going to speak to somebody who's been a writer on Sesame Street. I'm going to speak to somebody who has to teach science to kids. I'm going to go to the theatre. I'm going to go to an art gallery. Just absorbing things from all different areas. And I think there's something incredibly exciting about that.
Yeah.
So, Adam, thank you for coming in. I will let you leave the auditorium. Right. And good luck in Cannes.
Lovely to be on it. Thank you.
So that was my conversation in Marketing Room 101 with Adam Morgan. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed it as much as I did, I'd love it if you could please just pass it on to one person. And if you've done anything recently that you feel guilty about, in just 30 seconds you can leave a review wherever you get your podcasts and buy yourself some instant good karma. Finally, if you'd like to get in touch with me, or if you'd like to arrange a free chat about how the Principles team and I can help grow your brand, just find me on LinkedIn under my name, Ben Norman. I'm the one with no hair. And if you'd like to know more about Principles, just head to principlesagency.co.uk.